When Alice Roosevelt was a young woman living in her father's White House, President Theodore Roosevelt was asked why he didn't do something to control his wild, scandalous, impossible daughter. His answer became one of the most famous lines in American political history. He said, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice. I cannot possibly do both." He was the most powerful man in the world. He had charged up San Juan Hill, busted the great monopolies, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and bent Congress to his will. And he could not control his own teenage daughter, who was, at that moment, smoking cigarettes on the roof of the White House, sledding down the mansion's staircases on tea trays, carrying a pet garter snake named Emily Spinach in her handbag to formal receptions, and saying, out loud, in public, exactly what she thought about everyone in Washington. Her name was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and she would spend the next 79 years being the single most feared, most quoted, and most impossible to silence person in the capital of the United States. She was banned from the White House. President Taft barred her after she buried a voodoo doll of his wife in the front lawn. President Woodrow Wilson barred her after she told a bawdy joke at his expense, and she responded by working, from her Washington drawing room, to destroy his life's greatest ambition, the League of Nations, and she helped win. She dismissed Wilson as a whey-blooded schoolmaster. She said Calvin Coolidge looked as though he had been weaned on a pickle. She called her own cousin Franklin Roosevelt 1/3 mush and 2/3 Eleanor. She did a cruel and famous impersonation of her cousin Eleanor that delighted Republican Washington for a decade. And here is the thing that makes her story more than a collection of insults. Every president who tried to shut Alice Roosevelt Longworth up is dead and gone, and mostly forgotten in the specifics, and Alice outlasted all of them. She met 17 presidents, from Benjamin Harrison, who was in office when she was a child, all the way to Jimmy Carter. She was a Washington power for so long, and was consulted by so many presidents who came to understand that it was far smarter to court her than to cross her, that they called her the other Washington Monument. Kennedy wanted her at his table. Nixon adored her. Lyndon Johnson courted her. The men who ran the 20th century sought the approval of a woman whose entire official power was that she was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, and that she was smarter and funnier and more ruthless than any of them. She had a pillow on her sofa. It was embroidered with her personal philosophy, and it is the most famous thing she ever said. It read, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." She lived by it for 96 years. This is the story of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the White House wild child, who became the Queen of Washington, the woman 2 presidents tried to banish and could not silence, and who outlasted every single one of them. The other Washington Monument, the most dangerous tongue in American political history, and the little girl whose mother died 2 days after she was born, which is where the whole extraordinary story begins. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The most quotable woman in American history began her life with a tragedy she could not remember and never entirely escaped. Alice Lee Roosevelt was born on February 12, 1884, in the Roosevelt family home in Manhattan. Her father was Theodore Roosevelt, then a 25-year-old New York State Assemblyman, a rising political star, brilliant and intense and ferociously alive. Her mother was Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, a beautiful, gentle young woman whom Theodore had adored with the whole force of his enormous heart. The baby was healthy, the delivery went well, and then, within 48 hours, the young family was destroyed. 2 days after Alice was born, her mother died. The cause was undiagnosed kidney disease, Bright's disease, whose symptoms had been masked by the pregnancy. And in the same house, on the very same day, Theodore's mother, Alice's grandmother, also died of typhoid fever. February 14, 1884, Valentine's Day, took both women from Theodore Roosevelt in a single day. He wrote a large X in his diary, and beneath it a single line, "The light has gone out of my life." Theodore was shattered in a way that shaped the first years of his daughter's life. He could barely stand to be in the presence of the baby because the child was named Alice, after the wife he had lost, and to look at little Alice was to be reminded of the woman who had died giving her life. He never spoke his first wife's name again, not for the rest of his life. He did not talk about her. He erased her, out of a grief too large to carry, and in erasing her he could not fully embrace the daughter who carried her name. So baby Alice was handed to Theodore's sister, her Aunt Anna, called Bammy or Auntie Bai, a capable and loving woman who raised the infant through her earliest years while Theodore fled his grief. He went west, to the Dakota Badlands, to be a rancher and a cowboy, and to outrun the loss. When he returned and remarried, in 1886, to his childhood friend Edith Kermit Carow, Alice was brought back into her father's household, and she grew up at Sagamore Hill, the sprawling Roosevelt home on Long Island, with a stepmother and, eventually, 5 half-siblings. Edith was not cruel to Alice, but Alice always understood that she was different, the child of the first wife, the living reminder of the erased Alice, slightly outside the tight circle of Theodore and Edith's own children. She later reflected on this with the unsentimental clarity that would define her whole life. She knew her father loved her, but she also knew there was a distance, a thing that could not quite be crossed, rooted in the tragedy of her birth. She said, in her sharp way, that her father had wanted to forget her mother entirely, and that she, Alice, was the inconvenient evidence that her mother had ever existed. This is the wound at the center of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and it explains an enormous amount about the woman she became. A child who feels she must fight for attention, who senses a distance in the parent she adores, who is the living reminder of a grief no one will discuss, often becomes one of two things. She becomes withdrawn, or she becomes impossible to ignore. Alice chose the second path, with a vengeance that lasted 96 years. If she could not have her father's uncomplicated love, she would have the entire nation's attention. If there was a distance she could not cross at home, she would make herself the most talked-about person in every room she ever entered, for the rest of her life. She was, by every account, an extraordinarily intelligent child, a voracious, self-taught reader who devoured books and educated herself far beyond what her formal schooling provided. She was stubborn, willful, and strong-minded from the beginning. She wore a leg brace as a child for a condition affecting her legs, and she willed herself out of it, refusing to be limited. She was, in short, her father's daughter. All the Roosevelt intensity and intelligence and force of personality concentrated in a girl who had learned early that the world would not simply hand her the love and attention she craved. She would have to seize them. And then, in September of 1901, when Alice was 17 years old, an anarchist shot President William McKinley, and 8 days later, McKinley died, and Theodore Roosevelt became the President of the United States. The Roosevelt family moved into the White House, and Alice Roosevelt, 17 years old, motherless, brilliant, attention-starved, and utterly unwilling to be controlled, moved into the most watched house in America, with the whole nation suddenly staring directly at her. She was about to give them a show they would never forget. Alice Roosevelt arrived in the White House in 1901 like a firework in a cathedral, and Washington had never seen anything like her. She was 17, beautiful, sharp-tongued, and completely uninterested in behaving the way a president's daughter was supposed to behave. And because her father was one of the most famous and beloved presidents in American history, and because the young, photogenic Roosevelt family fascinated the public, every single thing Alice did became national news. She was, in the most literal sense, America's first celebrity first daughter, famous the way movie stars would later be famous, before movie stars existed. And what she did with that fame was scandalize the country, gleefully, on a near-daily basis. She smoked cigarettes, which respectable women simply did not do in public in 1902, and when her father forbade her to smoke under his roof, she climbed onto the roof of the White House and smoked there, technically obeying him, while publicly defying him, a perfect distillation of her entire method. She was seen placing bets with bookies. She carried a pet garter snake named Emily Spinach. Named, she cheerfully explained, after a disliked thin aunt named Emily and the snake's green color. She would pull the snake out of her purse at formal parties and receptions to watch the guests recoil. She drove her own automobile, at high speed, unchaperoned, another shocking thing for a young woman. She stayed out late. She danced. She said outrageous things. She sledded down the White House staircases on tea trays borrowed from the kitchen. The press could not get enough of her. She was dubbed Princess Alice, and she became a genuine national phenomenon. A particular shade of blue-gray that she favored became known as Alice Blue, and it swept American fashion. A hit Broadway song, Alice Blue Gown, was written about it. Women copied her clothes, her hair, her attitude. Merchandise bore her name. She was, in an era before mass celebrity, one of the most famous and imitated young women in the world, and she was famous purely for being herself, loudly, in public, without apology. Her father, the president, was simultaneously proud, exasperated, and helpless. When a visitor to the White House complained about Alice's constant interruptions and wild behavior, Theodore Roosevelt delivered the line that has defined the relationship ever since. He said, "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice. I cannot possibly do both." It was said with affection and with genuine surrender. The man who could bend Congress and the trusts and the great powers of the world to his will had a teenage daughter he could not manage, and he knew it, and on some level he admired her for it, because she was so completely, ferociously alive. But Alice was not merely a wild child, and this is the part that people who know only the snake and the cigarettes tend to miss. She was intensely intelligent and intensely political, and her father, recognizing this, actually used her. In 1905, he sent Alice as part of a large diplomatic delegation to Asia, led by Secretary of War William Howard Taft. The trip took her to Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, and Hawaii, and she was a sensation everywhere she went, treated like visiting royalty, the American princess. On the voyage, she behaved with her usual flamboyance, at one point famously jumping into the ship's pool fully clothed and coaxing a congressman in after her. But the trip was also serious diplomacy, conducted at a delicate moment in relations between the United States and a rising Japan. And Alice was a genuine asset, a charismatic representative of American power and goodwill. She was learning, on that trip, that her fame and her charm were not just for scandal, they were instruments of power. It was also on that 1905 delegation that her relationship with a congressman named Nicholas Longworth deepened. Longworth was a Republican representative from Ohio, from a wealthy and established Cincinnati family, charming, sociable, a talented violinist, well-liked in Washington, and 15 years older than Alice. He was also, already, a heavy drinker and a womanizer, though Alice either did not fully see this or chose to overlook it. They had been courting, and on the Asia trip the romance advanced, and not long after their return they were engaged. On February 17, 1906, Alice Roosevelt married Nicholas Longworth in the East Room of the White House, in what was one of the most spectacular and heavily covered weddings in American history to that point. The president's celebrity daughter marrying a rising congressman in the White House itself was the social event of the age. Alice, characteristically, cut the wedding cake with a sword borrowed from a military aide, because an ordinary knife was not dramatic enough. Gifts poured in from around the world, including from foreign heads of state. She was 22 years old, the most famous young woman in America, married to a congressman, and about to discover that the marriage she had entered was going to be a long and painful disappointment, and that her real love, the love that would define and sustain her for the rest of her life, was not going to be a man at all. It was going to be power, political power, and the game of Washington, which she was about to master more completely than almost anyone in American history. The marriage of Alice Roosevelt and Nicholas Longworth looked, from the outside, like a merger of two great political families. From the inside, It was something colder and more complicated. Nick Longworth was charming and well-connected and genuinely fond of Alice, and she of him, in their way. But he was also, as Alice came to understand fully, a serious alcoholic and a persistent womanizer, and both of those things wore on the marriage from early on. Alice, who had watched her father's disciplined vitality her whole life, had no tolerance for drunkenness, and Nick's drinking disgusted her. His infidelities were widely known in Washington. Alice was not, by temperament, a woman who suffered such things quietly or sentimentally, and the marriage settled into a kind of arrangement, two ambitious, socially powerful people sharing a life and a political project without much romantic warmth at the center of it. But if the marriage was a disappointment, Washington itself was not, because Alice discovered in these years that she had a genuine vocation, and it was politics. Not politics as a candidate, which was closed to women in that era, but politics as an operator, a strategist, a hostess whose dinner table was a place where real deals were struck and real power was exercised. She began building the thing that would define the rest of her life, a salon, a political gathering place, where she brought together the powerful and the clever and the useful, and where, through conversation and wit and sheer force of personality, she made herself indispensable to the men who ran the country. She was also, from the start, a partisan operator with sharp elbows, and her first great political drama tore her marriage down the middle. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, having left the presidency in 1909 and grown disgusted with his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, decided to run for president again, breaking from the Republican Party to form his own progressive party, the famous Bull Moose. This split the Republicans catastrophically, and it split the Longworth household right along with them. Alice, fiercely, absolutely loyal to her father, threw herself into Theodore's progressive campaign. Her husband, Nicholas Longworth, was a loyal Republican congressman who stood with Taft. Husband and wife were now on opposite sides of a bitter national contest, and Alice campaigned against her own husband's party, for her father, without hesitation. Family came first, and her father was the great love of her life. The 1912 election was a disaster for everyone in the family. The Republican split handed the presidency to the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, and Nicholas Longworth, partly because of the Roosevelt split, and partly, it was whispered, because his own wife had campaigned against his party, lost his seat in Congress. Alice had helped cost her husband his job out of loyalty to her father. It tells you everything about her priorities, and it did not improve the marriage. There was also, in this period, the incident that produced her first banishment from the White House, and it involved the Tafts. Alice loathed the Tafts, in part over the betrayal of her father, and her contempt expressed itself in one of the most gloriously petty acts in the history of American politics. When the Roosevelts had left the White House and the Tafts moved in, Alice buried a voodoo doll of Nellie Taft, the new First Lady, in the front lawn of the White House. The Taft administration, upon discovering this, barred Alice from the White House. She was, for the first time, banished from her childhood home for bad behavior. It would not be the last time. Through all of this, Alice was sharpening the weapon that would make her legendary, her tongue. She had a gift, a genuinely rare and lethal gift, for the devastating one-line character assassination. She could sum up a powerful man in a single phrase that stuck to him for the rest of his life and beyond. Her wit was not gentle. It was, in the words of those who knew her, brilliantly malicious. She did not soften her observations to spare feelings. She sharpened them to draw blood, and Washington both feared and adored her for it, because there is nothing the powerful enjoy more than a devastating joke about a rival, and nothing they fear more than being its target. Then, on January 6, 1919, the great love of Alice's life died. Theodore Roosevelt, only 60 years old, worn down by illness and by the death of his youngest son Quentin in the First World War, died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill. Alice was devastated in a way that went beyond ordinary grief. Her father had been the son her whole life orbited, the person whose attention she had craved since infancy, the man whose approval defined her, and now he was gone. But Alice Roosevelt did not collapse into mourning. She did something more characteristic. She picked up her father's political mantle and carried it forward herself. Theodore had been, at the end of his life, a fierce opponent of Woodrow Wilson and everything Wilson stood for. And Alice, grieving, furious, and more politically formidable than ever, took up that fight as her inheritance. She would carry on her father's war against Woodrow Wilson, and she was about to win it, from her drawing room, against the President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson and the Roosevelts hated each other, and the hatred was mutual, personal, and deep. Theodore Roosevelt had despised Wilson. When Wilson refused to let the aging Theodore raise and lead a volunteer division to fight in the First World War, Theodore had called him an infernal skunk. Alice inherited the contempt hole. She dismissed the scholarly, moralistic Wilson as a way-blooded schoolmaster, a phrase that captured her view of him perfectly. Bloodless, preachy, superior, everything the vital, physical, plain-spoken Roosevelts were not, and Wilson returned the feeling. At some point during his administration, Alice told a bawdy, off-color joke at Wilson's expense, and the Wilson White House, which did not share the Roosevelt sense of humor, barred her from the premises. It was her second banishment. Taft had exiled her for the voodoo doll. Wilson exiled her for the joke. Being banished from the White House would have chastened an ordinary political wife. It energized Alice. If she could not fight Wilson from inside the White House, she would fight him from her own house, and in the great political battle of Wilson's presidency, she did exactly that, and she helped defeat him utterly. The battle was over the League of Nations. Wilson, at the end of the First World War, had staked his entire legacy, his life's greatest ambition, on the creation of the League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future wars, and on American membership in it, through ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. For Wilson, this was the culmination of everything, the thing he believed would redeem the slaughter of the war and reshape the world for peace. It required the approval of the United States Senate. Alice Roosevelt Longworth set out to make sure it did not get it. She became a central figure in the Washington social and political campaign against the League. She used the weapon she had been building for a decade, her salon, her dinner table, her web of relationships with the powerful men of the Senate. She brought the opponents of the League together in her home. She strategized with them. She encouraged them, flattered them, stiffened their resolve, and mocked anyone who wavered. When Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the leader of the opposition, showed any sign of compromising toward Wilson, Alice was there to needle him back into intransigence. She was, in the language of a later era, a whip and an organizer and a morale officer for the anti-League forces, operating entirely through social and personal influence because that was the only political power available to a woman, and she wielded it with devastating effectiveness. She and the other opponents called themselves, only half-jokingly, the Battalion of Death, the irreconcilables who would kill the League no matter what, and they won. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson's great dream died in the Senate, and the effort to save it destroyed him physically. He suffered a devastating stroke while touring the country to rally public support, and he spent the rest of his presidency an invalid, hidden from public view, his ambition in ruins. Alice Roosevelt Longworth had helped defeat the President of the United States on the central question of his presidency, from her drawing room, while banned from his house. It was one of the most remarkable exercises of unofficial political power by any American woman of her era, and it established her, permanently, as a genuine force in national politics, rather than merely a witty socialite. And it was during this fight, drawn together by their shared opposition to the League, that Alice fell in love, really in love, for what may have been the first and only time in her life. The man was William Borah, the Republican senator from Idaho. Borah was one of the most impressive figures in the Senate, a brilliant orator, a constitutional expert, a powerful and independent thinker, one of the few senators believed capable of changing his colleagues' votes with a single speech. He was a leader of the fight against the League, which is what brought him and Alice together, and Alice, who valued political brilliance above almost everything, was captivated by him. He was married. So was she. Neither fact stopped anything. The affair between Alice Roosevelt Longworth and Senator William Borah became one of the great open secrets of Washington. It was widely known in political circles, discussed and understood, even as it remained hidden from the general public. And it was serious, and it lasted, and it produced, in 1925, when Alice was 40 years old, the great secret of her life. She had a baby. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In February of 1925, Alice Roosevelt Longworth gave birth to her only child, a daughter, at the age of 40. The baby was named Paulina, and though the child was raised as the daughter of Nicholas Longworth, it was an open secret in Washington, confirmed decades later when Alice's own diaries were opened to researchers, that Paulina's father was not Nick Longworth at all. Her father was Senator William Borah. Alice, characteristically, treated the entire scandalous situation as an occasion for wit. She had, she confided, considered naming the baby Deborah, which she found delicious because it could be passed as Deborah, a sly public acknowledgement of the father hidden inside the child's name. She decided against it, but the joke circulated among those in the know, and a family friend reported that people privately called the baby Aurora Bora Alice, a triple pun on the Aurora Borealis, Borah's name, and Alice's own. Only Alice Roosevelt Longworth could turn the illegitimate paternity of her own child into a running series of clever wordplays. It was pure Alice. The sharper the personal situation, the sharper the joke she made of it. The domestic arrangement that surrounded Paulina's birth was extraordinary, even by Washington standards. In the 1920s, Alice was intimately connected to two of the most powerful men in the American government at the same time. Her husband, Nicholas Longworth, became Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1925, the second most powerful elected official in the country, and her lover, William Borah, was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most powerful men in the Senate. Alice Roosevelt Longworth sat, quite literally, at the intersection of the House and the Senate, married to the leader of one chamber and the lover of a leader of the other, with a daughter fathered by the second man and raised in the household of the first. Whether Nicholas Longworth knew that Paulina was not his child is one of the questions history cannot fully answer. He raised her as his own. Photographs from the period show little Paulina being taken to the Capitol to have lunch with her daddy, the Speaker of the House, a beloved and famous child, one of the most photographed babies in America. Whatever Nick knew or suspected, he played the role of father, and the marriage, cold as it was, held together as a political and social partnership. But the marriage was, by this point, largely a shell. Alice and Nick lived increasingly separate lives, bound by politics and social position rather than affection. And then, in 1931, Nicholas Longworth died of pneumonia, while Alice was still a relatively young woman of 47. She was now a widow. Her lover, Borah, would remain in the Senate until his own death in 1940, but the affair faded, and Alice never remarried, and never, as far as the record shows, had another great romance. The men were essentially finished. What remained was power, and Washington, and her daughter, and her wit, and those would have to be enough for the next half-century, because Alice Roosevelt Longworth was going to live a very, very long time. The loss of Nick, cold as their marriage had become, and the earlier loss of her father, left Alice increasingly alone at the center of her own life, and she poured herself more completely than ever into the two things that never failed her: politics and her salon. Her home near Dupont Circle became the single most important private political gathering place in Washington, and it would remain so for decades. To be invited to Alice's table was to have arrived. To be excluded was to be nobody. And to be seated beside her, and to become the target of her wit, was to be simultaneously honoured and terrified, because you never knew whether the famous tongue would flatter you or flay you. She sharpened her insults into an art form that outlived nearly everyone she aimed them at. Her pillow, embroidered with, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me," was not a joke about her personality. It was an accurate advertisement of the service she provided. People came to Alice precisely to hear the wicked, brilliant, unsayable truth about the powerful, delivered in a phrase so perfect it became permanent. She was the person who said what everyone else was thinking, and no one else dared voice, and she said it better than anyone. But underneath the glittering, malicious public performance, a private tragedy was unfolding, and it centered on the one person Alice could not conquer with wit or power, her own daughter. Because Paulina Longworth was nothing like her mother. Where Alice was sharp, dazzling, aggressive, and armored, Paulina was gentle, quiet, meek, painfully shy, and fragile. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a sweet and mild person, entirely unsuited to being the daughter of the most formidable woman in Washington, and growing up in the shadow of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, did to Paulina exactly what you might fear it would do. It overwhelmed her, and the wit that Alice deployed so mercilessly on presidents and senators was not always withheld at home, and a sensitive child does not thrive under a brilliant, demanding, sardonic mother who has little patience for weakness. Paulina was heading toward a tragedy that would become the great private grief of Alice's long life, and it would test whether the armored, impossible, invulnerable Queen of Washington had a heart underneath the wit after all. Through the 1930s and 1940s, while her private life carried its hidden strains, Alice Roosevelt Longworth reached the height of her public power, and she spent much of it at war with her own family. Because in 1933, a Roosevelt returned to the White House, but it was the wrong Roosevelt, as far as Alice was concerned. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Alice's fifth cousin, and his wife Eleanor, Alice's first cousin, the niece of Theodore, moved into the White House at the start of the New Deal, and they would stay for an unprecedented 12 years. And Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the Republican Roosevelt, the keeper of her father Theodore's conservative progressive flame, became one of the most prominent and quotable opponents of Franklin and Eleanor's Democratic administration in the country. She was relentless, and she was funny, and she was frequently cruel. She campaigned against Franklin in all 4 of his presidential campaigns. She dismissed him with the line that became famous. She said, "Franklin Roosevelt was 1/3 mush and 2/3 Eleanor," a devastating double insult that diminished both the president and the first lady in 7 words. And her treatment of her cousin Eleanor was, by any measure, unkind. Alice did a cruel impersonation of Eleanor, mocking her earnest manner, her prominent teeth, her high voice, her do-gooder sincerity, and this impersonation was a favorite entertainment in Republican Washington throughout the long New Deal years. Eleanor was everything Alice was not, sincere where Alice was ironic, warm where Alice was sharp, devoted to earnest public service where Alice was devoted to wit and power. The 2 cousins represented 2 completely opposite models of what a politically engaged American woman could be, and Alice made sport of Eleanor's model for a decade. There was, beneath the political opposition, something more personal and less attractive in it, and honest accounts of Alice acknowledge this. Eleanor had grown up shy, awkward, and insecure, and had built herself into a figure of genuine moral stature through sheer effort and conviction. Alice, the dazzling one, the beautiful and celebrated one, never fully credited what her cousin had become, and her mockery of Eleanor sometimes read less as political disagreement than as an old, unresolved competition between 2 women who had both, in different ways, been shaped by loss and by the Roosevelt name. Alice's politics in this period were fierce and sometimes troubling. She was a committed isolationist, opposed to American involvement in the gathering Second World War, and she served on the National Board of the America First Committee, the organization dedicated to keeping the United States out of the war, right up until the attack on Pearl Harbor made the argument moot. She was, in these years, one of the loudest conservative voices in Washington, using her salon and her celebrity and her devastating tongue in service of causes that placed her in permanent opposition to the dominant liberalism of the age. But while Alice was conquering Washington as the Republican Roosevelt, the private tragedy at the center of her life was deepening, and it involved her daughter Paulina. Paulina had grown into a gentle, fragile, deeply troubled young woman. She had married a man named Alexander Sturm in 1944, and the couple had a daughter, Joanna, Alice's granddaughter. But Paulina's life was marked by depression and by struggles with alcohol, and by some accounts, other substances, the private pain of a sensitive person who had never found her footing in the world and who had grown up in the crushing shadow of an overwhelming mother. Her husband Alexander Sturm died young, in 1951, which deepened Paulina's despair. And in 1957, Paulina Longworth Sturm died. She was only 31 years old. The death was understood by those close to the family to have been connected to her long struggles, an overdose, whether accidental or not, the tragic end of a life that had never been able to bear the weight it was born into. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, 73 years old, the invulnerable Queen of Washington, the woman who had buried her mother in infancy, and her father in her 30s, and her husband in her 40s, now buried her only child. And here, in the deepest grief of her life, Alice revealed the thing the wit had always concealed, which was that underneath the armor there was a person who could love and could be devastated. Paulina's death struck Alice profoundly. Whatever failures had marked their relationship, whatever coldness or impatience Alice had shown her fragile daughter, the loss was real, and it was crushing. And Alice did something that redeemed a great deal. She took custody of her orphaned granddaughter, Joanna, then a child, and she raised her. The formidable woman in her 70s, who might have handed the child off to others as her own father had once handed her to an aunt, instead brought Joanna into her home and raised her herself, and the two of them developed a genuinely close and loving bond that lasted the rest of Alice's life. Joanna became Alice's companion, her family, the person who was with her at the end. In raising her granddaughter, Alice did for Joanna something closer to what had not been fully done for her. She stayed, she was present, she loved the child openly. The wit went on, the salon went on, the insults went on. But those who knew Alice Roosevelt Longworth understood, after Paulina, that the woman with the sharpest tongue in America had a well of private grief, as deep as her public brilliance was dazzling, and that she carried it, as she carried everything, without ever once asking for sympathy. Alice Roosevelt Longworth lived so long that she became a kind of living monument, the last connection to a vanished age, and Washington took to calling her exactly that, the other Washington Monument. Think about the span of her life. She was born in 1884, when Chester Arthur was president, and the memory of the Civil War was still fresh. She died in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was president, and men had walked on the moon. She met 17 presidents of the United States, from Benjamin Harrison, whom she knew as a child, through her own father, through the men she fought and the men she charmed, all the way to Carter. She was a figure in Washington society and politics for nearly 80 consecutive years. Presidents came and went, rose and fell, were elected and defeated and buried, and Alice remained, at her table near Dupont Circle, sharper than all of them, outlasting them one after another. And in her later decades, a remarkable thing happened. The woman who had been banished by Taft and Wilson, who had fought Franklin Roosevelt for 12 years, became something that every ambitious politician in Washington wanted: a prize, an endorsement, a validation. To be invited to Alice's salon, to be seated at her table, to earn her approval and survive her wit, became a mark of having truly arrived in Washington. The presidents who came after the ones who tried to silence her learned the opposite lesson. They courted her. Her political friendships in these years crossed every line you might expect her to hold. She was, above all, devoted to Richard Nixon. She had befriended him when he was Eisenhower's vice president and supported him loyally through his career, and she can be heard on the Nixon White House tapes, in her 80s, gossiping and skewering Democrats with the President of the United States. But she was not a simple partisan in her affections. Though she had opposed John F. Kennedy in 1960, she became genuinely charmed by the Kennedy family once they were in power, and she said, in her wry way, that she learned from them how amusing and attractive Democrats could be. Kennedy wanted her at his table. She developed a real, if prickly, friendship with Robert Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson courted her. She voted for Johnson in 1964. She was a guest at the White House wedding of Nixon's daughter Tricia. The men who ran the country across the middle of the 20th century, Republican and Democrat alike, sought the company and the blessing of a woman whose only office was hostess and whose only power was that she was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter and the wittiest person in Washington. And the wit never dulled, not even into extreme old age, not even in the face of her own mortality. Late in her life, Alice underwent a mastectomy, and then a second one, a double mastectomy, for breast cancer. A frail, elderly woman might have kept such a thing private. Alice announced, with characteristic defiance, that she was now Washington's only topless octogenarian. She was in her 80s, she had survived cancer surgery, and her response was a joke that turned the whole grim business into an occasion for laughter on her own terms. It was the exact same method she had used since she was 17 years old on the White House roof. Take the thing that was supposed to shame or diminish you and make it, instead, the material for your own performance, so that you were never the victim of the story, but always its author. That was the deepest secret of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, underneath all the malice and all the glamour. She had learned, as a motherless child who felt her father's distance, that the way to survive was to refuse to be pitied, to refuse to be controlled, to refuse to be silenced, and to make herself, always, the one who spoke rather than the one who was spoken about. 2 presidents banished her, and she outlasted them and helped destroy the great ambition of one of them. Her marriage disappointed her, and she built a private empire of influence that no husband could have given her. Her daughter's death broke her heart, and she answered it by raising her granddaughter and going on. Life kept trying to make her a victim, and she kept refusing, with a joke, for 96 years. Alice Roosevelt Longworth died on February 20, 1980, in Washington, D.C., 8 days after her 96th birthday. Her granddaughter Joanna, the child she had raised, was with her. She was the longest living child of any American president. The nation's newspapers marked the passing of a woman who had reigned in the Capitol for the better part of a century, an institution, an era ending. Look at the whole shape of it. A baby whose mother died before she was 2 days old, handed off by a grieving father who could not bear to look at her. A wild teenager who seized the nation's attention because she could not be certain of her father's love. A brilliant political operator who beat a president from her drawing room. A woman who loved and lost and grieved in private, while never once, in public, surrendering the upper hand. And at the end, the other Washington monument, the last living link to Theodore Roosevelt's America, having outlasted every rival, every enemy, every president who ever tried to shut her up. She kept a pillow on her sofa, embroidered with the words that were her whole philosophy: "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." It sounds, at first, like simple wickedness, but there was something braver in it than that. It was the motto of a woman who had decided, as a motherless child, that she would never be boring, never be pitiable, never be quiet, and never, ever be silenced. And she never was. 17 presidents, 96 years, 2 banishments, and 1 unbroken, unstoppable, unsilenceable voice. They tried to make her sit down and be quiet. Alice Roosevelt Longworth outlived them all and got the last word every single time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.